Before we start, my name is Claudio. I got more or less 7 years of experience in PHP development, partly with Drupal, but most of the time with other frameworks such as Zend or Symfony. I'm also one of the founders of the Drupal Association, and more or less I worked in Italy, France, and Germany, where I'm at the moment. Continuous integration, especially when talking to people who's used to develop with frameworks, is quite a common stuff. But I found myself in a situation where a lot of times those people were considering Drupal and complaining they couldn't really get the same development process as they had like with Rails or whatever. I mean, like Zend and stuff like that. There was quite a problem around the time Drupal 7 came out, was released. But today I think we can manage to get a quite functioning process with using a trick or two, and so that more or less we can handle Drupal the same way we actually handle the development process with other frameworks such as Zend or Symfony. So let's start defining what continuous integration is. It's a practice of merging many developer environments into one mainline several times a day or a week. And in other words, it means, okay, we got a bunch of developers, they work on different features and stuff, and at some point they need to join their work into just one installation, one website. And that's what continuous integration is about. It's also giving the ability to build the current status of your application in an automatic fashion. And we are going to see which tools we're going to employ for achieving this. Testing is well, I'd like to really make a long story very short. Basically, it started with unit testing that wanted to achieve a couple of goals. Basically, giving the opportunity to developers to write automated tests, so to increase confidence and to be sure that the code was actually working. And that was about actual code. So testing was more about classes or functions and methods. So it was more on the developer perspective than testing the actual product. Then TDD came out, and they basically turned the way tests were written, because Ken Beck is one of the authors, one of the guy who wrote this theory, and basically he said, okay, let's use tests as a way to design our objects, our library, our code. And so they started writing tests first. So you write the test, and then you write the code. The test has to fail, then you write the code to make it pass, and then when the test passes, you refactor and start over with new things. It's a way to drive design through tests. And then there's behavior-driven development that combines this practice of writing tests first with domain-driven design that basically it's about setting the expectation from the domain and then writing tests against those kind of expectations. So it's more about how your website is or your application is meant to to work. I like this matrix. It gives us a good map of the domain of testing that help us into defining which fields we are going to look at today. Basically, it's been written by Brian Merrick, which is one of the guys who wrote the Agile Manifesto, and basically it says that when you have to start testing, you have to identify a few things. First of all, if it's like you're facing business or technology issues. So if you're actually expressing what you need to express in a way that it can be understood by a business owner, like a client that's more about more into the domain that you have to work with, or if it's more into the developer world. So, and also if those tests have to support programming, which means that they are used actually for the development process to check that the code's work as expected, or the entire application is behaving as the specs say. Or on the other hand, if they are just there to critique the product, so it's performant enough, or if it's usable enough, that actually are not concerned about the actual functioning of the application. So what I would like to talk about today is a bunch of softwares that actually allow us to put all these ideas together and to achieve the fully continuous integration process, and also some testing. So the first one, probably one of the most important pieces is Jenkins. It's a quite ancient piece of Java software that was namely called Hudson, but then when Oracle bought Sun Microsystems, it has been forked, and this is like the open source version now. And its task is to actually monitor the execution of the job. So it's basically like the conductor of an orchestra, if you will, and basically it allows you to create jobs that describe how you build that specific version of your application. It's sort of a container. So this is actually what enables us to use the continuous integration. It's a sort of a cage, and it automates all the tasks needed for the process on the outside. So it basically takes the repository with your code, executes some scripts, in our case like a thing for building stuff, building the actual website, and then publishes results of the test and stuff like that. So it's actually what's in control of the whole process. And I think it's even if it's Java, it's pretty easy to install. So you can just use, I don't know, if you're using Debian or Ubuntu, it has its own repositories. You can install it, and it just runs fine and never complain. It's pretty good, and also it's configurable entirely through the UI. So it's probably the easiest piece that you will find here. So Thing instead is a build tool that is derived from Apache-Ant, is written in PHP and is for PHP, and so that offers the opportunity to PHP developers to extend it in a quite easy way. And what it does is to actually give us a standard way to write scripts, if you will, in a declarative way, so in XML, and it also supports a lot of functions out of the box, like you can do queries on a database, or move files around, open SSH connections and stuff like that. And it also comes with a Drush integration. So there's really a huge amount of functions already there, and more or less it looks like this. Okay. Can you read it? So basically, it's an XML that describes some steps that you have to do in order to build your application. And we're going to look into a Drupal-specific one in a while. So I will probably show you later, an actual working example of how we build the Drupal website through Thing. Drush probably doesn't need much introduction. It's basically a shell interface for Drupal. So we can use you can command Drupal through the command line. It offers a huge amount of functionalities, like, I don't know, you can again query the database through Rush from the command line, or get information about users, dump the database, and stuff like that. And in our case, it's very important because we're going to leverage its functionalities in two places, basically, which are Ping for automating the build of the website, and for testing, because Behat relies on it for doing operations on Drupal during the test phase. And we're going to take a look at that too. Then there is PHPUnit. Actually, Drupal has simple test as the default testing framework, but I didn't find very comfortable to use it because PHPUnit is the de facto standard for testing PHP applications, and so I took it and integrated it into our process instead of simple test. And basically, it's about unit testing. So its primary goal is to give you the tools for testing your code in isolation in order to check that it behaves the way you expect. And it has a huge amount of functionalities that allows you to do so. Like, it has a good set of assertions that basically are functions that check that, I don't know, like a variable or the output of a function or whatever you want to test is actually meeting your expectation. Like, I don't know, if an array has the keys or if an object is like what you expect it to be and stuff like that. It offers you fixtures handling. Basically, fixtures are a way to set the state of your environment in an expected. Sorry, I'll rephrase that. Fixtures are basically data that you need to have in your test before it runs it to actually have a correct state for testing what you're going to test, like a function or a class and stuff like that. It also has a huge set of libraries and functions for database testing, and also for mocking objects that are very useful for when you need to actually create a fake class that behaves that actually just looks like a class that you need to represent, but it's actually not behaving like that in a complete way, and that's useful when you need to isolate a specific class you're testing. So let's say that class has dependency on other 3 classes, and you want to isolate it so that the actual dependency are not the real one. So you put mock objects into it, and there's a huge library for mocking objects as well. PHPUnit also generates code coverage analysis. That means that when you write test, it's able to detect how much of your code is actually triggered by the test. So let's say you have a function with 100 lines of code, and you write a test, and probably the path that the text executes triggers or at least pass through 50 lines of code, and so you actually know what code in your functions get called through this kind of analysis. And also it supports a few logging formats that are useful, for instance, in Jenkins, if we want to actually check what was wrong and what was actually working, and generates graphs and stuff like that, so that we can read that in a human readable format. And so probably the biggest and the most important thing for Drupal, for testing Drupal as a CompleteBoxes Behat, which is a library that allows us to write human readable tests in a language called Gherkin. That basically it's English, if you will, with a specific format, and basically you describe stories with that. And by writing those kind of stories, you are also able to define acceptance criteria for what you're doing. Like, I expect that, I don't know, this page works like this, and we're going to take a look at how that means in a second. But so also, you can actually run those tests so that it's particularly useful because you have something readable from a human that's also runnable from a machine. And this allows you to reduce the ambiguity that you have, like, between, you know, the actors you have in a project, being them like developers and clients, business owners, testers, depending on, you know, on the situation. But this thing helps you to reduce the communication problems, if you will. And also, it gives us the opportunity to test in a, you know, you write it once and then everybody benefits from it. So what is this about? You have feature files that define a specific criteria you have to verify. Like in this case, we have a feature called front page, and we see in the first line we have the benefit. So the benefit in this case is I need to order. I need to access the website. I have a role, the anonymous user, and the feature itself is seeing the login form. So this describes what this feature does, and it's not really important to be hacked because it's just for you know, reading purposes. So it's just a description. What actually describes the tests are the scenarios that you have, as many scenarios as you need to verify the feature that you defined earlier. So in this case, we want to test that the login page shows the correct buttons. Let's say that your website allows just for login and you know, for the forget password functionality, and you don't allow users to register. And so you say, like, you set the context. I am on the home page, for instance. In this case, the event is not set because it's not something that's happening, like I'm pressing a button or stuff like that, and then you just test the outcome. So whenever I am on the home page, I should not see a link for registration, and I should see the link for login and forgot password. This is what is going to, you know, be transformed to a test, and this is the way the statements we've seen before, hooks, you know, get hooked and executed. So we see that I should see the link login. This is a method from a context class in which Behat runs all the scenarios that basically has this annotation. You see the first line in the comment. That's an annotation. It's not a simple comment, and basically that gets parsed and interpreted and as a regex. So whenever Behat finds a line that matches that regex, the regular expression, it runs this method. In this case, it relies on another library that's like it's called Mink, which is an abstraction library that is able to control through a number of drivers, like headless browsers such as Good, or I don't know, other libraries, other drivers like Selenium. So you're able through PHP to control those browsers in a coherent way because there's Mink that abstracts it all. And so in this case, you get the page from the session, and then you find the link that you specified. In our case was login, and if you find it, it's okay. If the link doesn't get found, then it throws an exception, and you know your test failed because it reports it. So these are like the big guys in our mix, but there are a few other pieces. Not that Git is a small part, but in this process we use Git for versioning the code. Subversion or Mercurial would be the same. we've got the Drush thing task that I already mentioned, that basically integrates the Drush functionalities into Thing. So you actually write some XML that is more or less the same thing as writing Drush commands on the command line. So that's what it does. We have the Drush, the Drupal Behat extension that relies on a Drush driver to send comments to Drupal in order to test. Like, okay, if you want to log in as a user, then you can do that through Drupal, the Drupal Behat extension, because it has the connections to Drush. Also, there's a migrate module that's very important for importing fixture and actual content, and that's a very powerful module. And I suggest you to take a look at it, because it's when you have to deal with content, that's probably the way to go. And then features that we probably all know about, that exports configuration, Drupal configuration into code, allowing us to version it and to replicate configuration on different environments. So there are also some files that we are going to actually look into in a while. So the gitignore file is quite important in this case, because we need to actually exclude a lot of stuff that we don't need to version, such as like the module directory or all the Drupal core directories, for instance. There's the Drush make file for the dependencies, so that we can keep track of all the modules, themes, and libraries that we need this way, so we don't need to actually put them in our repository. The build XML file, that's the theme file that contains all the steps for building it. The properties file, which basically are variables for Thing divided by environment. And then the behat configuration file, that the behat.yaml dist is a template for the configuration file, for the behat configuration file, that gets then copied by Thing, and it gets the values, the variables copied into it, depending on the environment. So the environments that we use, or we defined, actually we didn't define them. They're borrowed from the Zen architecture guide, R5. So the first three are this one, local, dev, and stage. The first one is the developer machine, where we do the actual work. Then there's the dev environment, which is the one on top of which the continuous integration happens. So every time, ideally, somebody pushes a modification on the repository, like, I don't know, you export a feature, you push it, and then the Git triggers thanks to a post receive hook Jenkins and tell him, okay, there's something new, rebuild the site from scratch, and do the test and stuff like that. This is very useful for catching errors as soon as possible, and I found it very, very, very useful in many, many times, and actually saved my back at least a couple of times. Then there's the stage environment, where we publish snapshots of our development environment, usually for testing purposes. Like, we are developing a website and we want the client to test some stuff that we more or less we finished. So instead of giving him the address of the dev environment, which is probably broken most of the time, or it's not reliable anyways, we just use our scripts or our configuration to create this sort of stable build for testing purposes. And then there are the other two environments. One is debug. That's not that common to use, but it can happen. That it is supposed to be a faithful copy of the production environment used to reproduce bugs and to test deploys. And finally, there's the production environment that's tuned for performance and optimized, and this is where the website actually goes in the end. So just to put all the things together. We have some actors here. So Jenkins is the guy who takes the repository for instance, the Git repository, clones it into his own directory, and then invokes thing, which does things like, I don't know, in case of Drupal, he runs drush make for downloading dependencies, then drush site install for installing the website, configures directories, files, and permissions, whatever is needed, and then it launches tests, so like PHPUnit or Behat, and those two softwares runs the test that we defined and publish the result, and logs the result into a JUnit format, which is XML basically. And when everything's done, Jenkins takes like the output from thing to check if the build is successful or not, checks the JUnit reports that they generated, perhaps run some post-build actions such as code analysis and stuff like that, and then the cycle is over. I would like to share this repository with you, which actually has all those things we discussed, all the files that you can play with. So I would like to actually see what has been done there. It's basically the result of our oh, this is wrong, by the way. This is Drupal 7 hyphens. Okay, so you can grab the code, and I would like to take a look at that with you. Probably better. Mirroring. Okay. So this is the base repository that we use. It's still in an early release. It's like alpha 1, but it contains all the pieces that we briefly seen before. I'd start from thing. So let's imagine that we're Jenkins. We just cloned the repository. We have now I'll enlarge it. We just, is it readable? Okay. We just cloned the repository and we have it there. And so we run thing. We say, okay, I want to build the dev environment, like the dev application. So I invoke like the proper target. We see this XML file defines one project, in this case called my site, and defaults to this dummy target. The target can be seen like as a function. So imagine that the project is a class, and each target it has is a function, and then we run functions. So Jenkins will say, okay, thing, run the dev app function, or in this case, target. So it'll start. It takes a look at the dependencies that it has. So it loads the properties. There are variables that defines, the specific configuration we need to put in place for that specific environment. In this case, let's imagine that we have a development server. That development server has two virtual hosts, one for dev and one for stage. So we need to correctly configure everything to like copy everything to the right directory or to use the right drush alias and stuff like that. So in this case, this is the thing property file for the dev environment, and those ones are the variables defined for that environment. For instance, we start with defining the name of the environment, so dev. The domain, in this case, it's dev.mysite.mycompany. Let's imagine, I don't know, dev.alpe-adria.drupal.com, for instance. A drush alias name, and then some configuration like the source database, destination database, because we need a source database for doing the build that actually runs on the same machine that Jenkins is running on. So because for installing Drupal you need an actual database. So we build everything locally and then we move everything on the destination environment. So here we have all the variables that define what our development environment looks like, and like the username and the password for the database and stuff like that. So what actually happens, the dev app got run. It has all those dependencies to actually satisfy to run before it runs what's into its code. So it loads the property files. Then it starts configuring the application. In our case, the app configure target looks like this. It's actually a container for another two thing call. So when it runs, it actually calls other two targets, one for configuring files and one for configuring the database. In this case, configuring files means just making sure that the dumps directory is existing for dumping the database with Drush. It creates the private path directory, and then it runs Drush make. Drush make is another target that's specifically for running Drush make, and it's here. So it does just two things. It prints to the shell that is running Drush make for for reading it, and then this is the thing Drush task that I mentioned earlier. So it defines, here it says, okay, run Drush using the command make with assuming yes, so it means -- yes on the command line, and use this make file as defined in the property file that we loaded earlier. So in our case, this app.make file is called mysite.make, and it contains all the projects that we're gonna need for all the modules that we need for developing, like Devel modules, themes, libraries, and stuff like that. So it's the equivalent of running Drush make on the command line. So this step then loads all the dependencies, and then we go back to the app configure, and when this task is done, it actually configures the database, if you will, which means installing Drupal. And here there is another target specifically for that, which is like the thing version for the Drush site install, which again is just run Drush site install with these options. So we specified site name, site email, account name pass, and etc., etc. We specify the profile, the installation profile for that we need. We provided a very basic installation profile with just a couple of things, like a feature for testing emails, or a few installation steps, very basic things like setting Italian language as the default one, stuff like that. Okay, so in this moment, we downloaded the dependencies and we installed Drupal on the local Jenkins environment. So we have like a DB called Jenkins, for instance, which holds the actual database that we're going to publish later. So we configured the files in the database, so we have more or less a working installation. But there are still a few steps to do. In this case, we disable developer modules to ease testing, because sometimes they can interfere and make things slow, which means a specific target for doing that's just Drush disable developer modules like Devel generate, Themer, diff, features UI, and stuff like that. Disable them and uninstall them. And finally, it uploads the application So that means drush rsync and drush SQL sync. And last but not least, it runs the tests, which is quite interesting. This is the target for running tests. So what it does, it prints, okay, I'm creating the behat configuration file, so it copies the distribution file, which is this one. Okay, where we define, all the configuration we need for running the test. In this case, I extended like the context for behat to automatically use HTTP authentication if it's specified, because sometimes we need to protect the dev environment or the stage environment, and so this configuration is used later in the behat context to save us from actually specifying those information in the test, which would be not meaningful at all. Like here we type the directory for our tests and configure the extensions. This is quite a basic thing, like the base URL against we're using for running the test, or where the files are stored, or which drivers are we using. Good, for instance, is a headless browser that's written in PHP, and so basically here you have the ability to interact with your application, but without JavaScript interactions. So if you need to test like HTML interaction or DOM manipulation interaction, that's the right choice, if you will, because it's quite fast. Otherwise, you need to use more advanced solution like Selenium or Zombie or Phantom.js that are actual, there are browsers that are able to run JavaScript. And here there is the Drupal extension configuration. Again, we define the alias that we use for running drush comments during tests. And here we have a few labels that we can reuse in the test, like to see, okay, let me see if there's a link named, I don't know, login again in the menu, in the region menu. These are just labels for our convenience that we can use in tests. So basically, getting back on the thing file, it gets this template, replaces all the variables. Like, since we are building for the dev environment, drush.alias needs to be the correct drush alias for interacting with the right environment. And so it basically copies that and expands those variables. And it copies the result to behat.yaml, which is the file that behat expects, looks for when it's starting and looking for configuration. Here it's some file system operation, making sure that the reports directory is there, the bin directory is there. It's pretty simple stuff. And then this task executes an actual shell command. So it runs curl for the loading composer, which is dependency manager for PHP that is required for setting up behat. So it downloads this script and install all the dependencies needed for behat. Optimizes some things, enables the modules needed just for testing. In this case, we prepared a module for testing emails. So basically, we had a set of rules. And we needed to make sure that the right emails were sent to the right people. So we basically put together this module for this feature for testing that, so that it actually logs the email into the watchdog table, and then we are able to query that to see to whom the emails are being sent. And yeah, here is setting like the proper email system for for allowing testing, setting variables on the drush on the specific drush alias, and finally running the test. here. Here we're specifying, okay, run on the command line the behat command, format the output in the jQuery output, and put everything into reports. So setting back the default values again, and now all the dependencies are satisfied. So dev app just finishes its process. It cleans up the local Jenkins database, so it drops the database. It's not useful anymore because everything has been copied to dev environment, and that ends the build basically. In this moment, if everything went fine, Jenkins just reads, okay, thing terminated properly. I found these files in the report directory, and so I publish everything. I should have a picture for that. Just to here you see like build number 40. We have the result of our tests. So basically, we see that through time there's been some tests failing, then and the number of tests increased. Like for example, the last thing, the last red hill was due to an error of mine that basically was I exported a feature with a field that was supposed to be multiple, but since I reused it in 2 places, the second time I used it, I configured it for being unique to just accept 1 value, and that broke like 20 tests together. So it's pretty useful to have this kind of security net for avoid very silly mistakes sometimes. And yes, so there's also some more here. Here's a convenient. There's an example Drush RC aliases file where I defined a template for 3 Drush aliases: the local environment, the dev environment, and the stage environment. That's for your convenience. And also I took the opportunity to configure PHPUnit and to write some integration for it. So we have here, where is it? Here. So this is basically the XML file for PHPUnit. We configure a few options for it. We define which tests should be executed, which which file types should be considered when executing tests, how to generate the test coverage, where to actually put through the JUnit report and stuff like that. And also, I've implemented an iterator for CSV files that's quite useful when I used it integrated with the migrate module where I wanted to test the migration files. I had some migration files like a user CSV, for instance, so that I imported into the installation. I used this iterator for writing tests on top of those files using data providers. So yeah, I think more or less I covered it all. There's one more thing. For staging environments, we are in a little different situation compared to the development environment. We can do more or less whatever we want with the dev environment. We can just break it and we don't really care as long as we are able to rebuild it. That's what's on it. It's not too important for the client. But sometimes, let's suppose that we're developing a certain feature, and then we say, okay, we publish that on stage, and then the clients need to try to test it and play with it, and then we still go on developing, and then we need some way to sync everything on stage without destroying it actually as we do on development. So in the case of stage, there are more specific targets for those reasons. One is the stage up install, which basically is the same as dev, and another one is the stage up update, which just doesn't destroy the whole environment, but just upload the new files and revert the features. So that's an update that doesn't destroy the target environment. So I think time's over. Here's the composer JSON file that defines the dependencies for Behat. I had to fork the original project to make it working with new releases, and also I expanded. Last thing, and then I was done. I extended the context for features, for the Behat features, so that we're able to access some functions in our test, like let me see, like get. I delete the latest content type created by a user. Let's imagine that we have a flow where users are creating, modifying, and then destroying nodes of a given type. And with this function, we're able to say something like, okay, I am on the latest node created by the customer, and then I want to delete it if there is a field named done, for instance. And we can do that with this extension, which I improved a bit. One last thing. This is the smoke test feature that we use. We include it every time. So basically, it checks that when you're on the home page and you press login, then you should see that some field is required or not. This is just a smoke test to verify that a deploy was actually working, because if this is the first test that gets run, and if this fails, you don't have to run all the others, because you know that your website basically is broken on dev or stage or whatever. Okay, I hope that if you want to take a look at the repository on GitHub and get started with all this, these things, it's Drupal 7 days. So it's here if you want to just play with it, or if you have questions, or you want to try to pick some pieces, and then you feel like asking questions, just feel free to do that. Here's a little, a very small procedure on how to get it working. But even just as a reference, if you want to pick some parts, it's there for you. Okay, thank you.